In this course, we're going to take a look at the role Azure Active Directory plays in the overall scheme of Azure as a cloud service. I'm your instructor, Corey Hines. I'm an MVP for Cloud and Data Center Automation, and I've been working in the IT field for about 20 years. I've held various positions such as a developer, a database administrator, network administrator and architect, and even a trainer and a speaker and an author at times. Been working with the Azure platform for the last couple of years and working with the Windows platform in general for well over 20 years now. This particular course has 3 topics. We're going to first look at what is Azure Active Directory and what's the general role that it plays. How is it different than your traditional Active Directory that you might be used to? Then we'll look at applications that integrate to Azure Active Directory and how it plays a role in implementing single sign-on across the entire space of applications available. And then finally, introducing multi-factor authentication as a way of making the authentication process for Azure that much more secure. In our first module, we're going to take a look at what is Azure Active Directory. So this is a multi-tenant cloud-based directory and identity management system. This is not the same directory that you use on-premise with Active Directory for user authentication, system management, group policy management. This is designed for being a full multi-tenant cloud application and managing identity across not just Azure, but many other platform and software as a service solutions as well. There's a lot of advanced identity management capabilities, such as things like multi-factor authentication, device registration, self-service user password and group management, role-based access control, application usage, and as well as auditing. This can be integrated with many cloud services such as Office 365 and even third-party services such as Salesforce or Box or Dropbox or any one of hundreds of different software applications available. Azure Active Directory provides a central database for users and identity so you can manage your users' permission to use applications, their ability to authenticate, all from a single central application. You don't need to worry about having, if you have multiple software as a service applications that you subscribe to, having different user databases and user directories spread across all these different platforms, providers, and services. There's some major differences between Active Directory and Active Directory that you have on-premise. For example, with Azure Active Directory, there's no such thing as group policy. It does not manage computers in the way that traditional Active Directory does. Computers can be registered, as in we know it exists, but we cannot enforce policies or management on it. There's no notion of an organizational unit. An Azure Active Directory tenant is a flat database of user accounts. And there's no support for forests. There's no support for trusts. We can, if we want to extend our scope of influence and our scope of management beyond the directory, we have to use federation. And in federation, we allow authentication to be managed by one directory and the authentication token, as in, hey, it's a valid user, to be sent back to the calling directory. So very vastly different than your traditional on-premise AD Active Directory services. The first step in managing Azure Active Directory is understanding the notion of domain names. By default, when you create an Azure subscription, a domain is created for you. Now that domain is going to be a combination of the email address that you use to sign up plus the domain suffix on Microsoft.com. So when you create and register a new Azure subscription, you automatically get one default Azure Active Directory domain, which is your onmicrosoft.com domain. And that's kind of where you start. You can now add any internet domain that you own to Azure AD so that you can have a vanity name so that users get to log on using a name that's very, very familiar to them. Such as, for example, they could log on as their email address. If they're bob@contoso.com, they can log on to Azure Active Directory as bob@contoso.com. All you have to do to add that domain to your Azure Active Directory is demonstrate that you own the namespace by demonstrating that you have control over the DNS servers that govern it. And so what you'll do is create a simple text record. It'll tell you what to create, and it'll use that to validate you have control now you can begin to use that domain you control within your Azure Active Directory namespace. In order to do this, you've got to be a global admin, right? And this by default, the user that creates the subscription. And we talked about the fact that you've got to be able to demonstrate ownership of the domain name. How you do this, there's two ways. Very important point. As of today, and again, we're midway through August of 2016, the Classic portal is where you're going to do your Azure Active Directory management tasks. All these tasks are not yet available in the new portal with Azure Resource Manager. So we're going to go to the Classic portal and we're going to go to the Azure Active Directory section. From there, we can add a domain that we control. We can also do this with PowerShell. There's a series of PowerShell commandlets, but you need to install specifically the Azure Active Directory module. So not the standard Azure module, you need the Azure Active Directory module to be able to administer this via PowerShell. Let's go ahead and take a look at how we create a custom domain. We'll take a look at the process now for creating a new custom Active Directory domain in my Azure subscription. So to do this in the marketplace, I'm going to click New and just simply type Active Directory. And this will bring me to the Active Directory entry that's in the marketplace. Click on it and you'll notice that it shows you a screenshot of the Classic portal. Well, that's because most functions for Azure Active Directory are still accomplished in the Classic portal. We'll click Create. It'll redirect us to the Classic portal and let us go through the process for creating a new custom Active Directory domain. Now, my particular domain is going to be an Active Directory domain that I'm going to use to store users for an application that we're building. And so I'm just going to call this one my app directory. And I'm going to call this one CJH app1 dir, just to make sure I've got a globally unique .onmicrosoft.com name. Country or region for the directory is going to be United States. And I'll click Create. And then it takes about, just 10 or 15 seconds to create the Active Directory. And once it's done, we'll be able to click on it. And you'll see that we can now do all the common Active Directory functions such as create users, create groups, or even integrate with an existing on-premises Windows Active Directory. Now, with any domain, especially an Active Directory domain, you often wonder, how do we do simple tasks like manage user accounts, manage group accounts? Well, within Azure Active Directory, you can do all these simple tasks. We can add, edit, and delete users, reset their password. We can also do the same thing with groups, add, edit, delete groups, and do their group membership. And this is done either through the Azure portal, through Windows PowerShell, or there's an option to do a bulk upload with a CSV file. This is a pretty common procedure if you're migrating from an on-premise Active Directory and you want to take all your users and migrate them to Azure Active Directory. You can do an export and then do a bulk import operation with Azure Active Directory using a CSV file as the input. Now, for the case of PowerShell, there's some pretty basic PowerShell commands. You'll notice that there's a theme, MSOL, get MS online user, remove MS online user, set MS online user. As well with groups, create new MSOL group, Microsoft Online Group. So all these commandlets that begin with MSOL are the commandlets that you're going to use to manage Azure to manage users and groups in Azure Active Directory. So with that, let's go in and take a look at some examples of these management tasks. Okay, let's go ahead and look at the process for adding multiple users and groups to an existing Azure Active Directory. So to do this, again, I do this through the Classic portal, manage.windowsazure.com. And again, just the functionality simply hasn't been migrated to the new portal yet. That'll be done at some stage in the future. So once we log on to our Classic portal, I'm going to go ahead and scroll down to my Azure Active Directory area, which is right here. Click on it, and we can see my app directory that I previously created. We'll click on that, and now we can begin the process of adding users and groups. So to add a new user, I simply click Add User. On the bottom, click Add User, and begin to create new user accounts. We can do a new user in my organization, with a Microsoft account in another directory, or users in partner companies if I'm federated. So we're going to make Bob. It's just real simple. And you'll notice we can assign him a role. Now, different role types have different levels of permission. For example, we're just going to make him a regular user, but I could make him, for example, a billing admin, which allows him to change billing information, or a password admin, which allows him to reset user passwords. Good role for someone, for example, on a help desk. And then go ahead and click Create. Now it's going to create a random password that I would then need to somehow communicate back to Bob. You can't force a specific password or assign a specific password using this portal. So I'll copy that, send it in an email or a secure instant message or something of that nature. Now we're going to make a group and add Bob to the group. So we'll go to Groups, click Add a Group, and this will be App Users. So this is a group of users that's allowed to log on to my application, for example. Now my application has to understand how to, look up Bob and see what groups he's in and make sure he's in the appropriate group, but that's up to the application developers to build that functionality. They don't have to worry about the functionality of users and groups and all those different administrative pieces. They're just relying on Azure Active Directory for that. They're simply using the end product, which is which users are in which groups. Click on OK, and now we can go into that group and we can add a member to that group. Now notice it says the group is still being configured. It might take a couple of minutes. We're going to go ahead and try anyway. Usually this happens pretty quick. So we'll click on Bob, hit the check mark, and if everything is well, there we go. So it allows us to add Bob to that group. So now we can see Bob's actually a member of that group. Now if Bob were, for example, an administrator, we could make him an owner of the group, which would allow him to then add other users to this group. So there you have it. Some pretty simple process for adding users and groups within Windows Azure. Keep in mind, you can do all this in PowerShell as well, as we showed you some of the commandlets. You just have to make sure you download the appropriate Azure Active Directory PowerShell module, and then all these functions are available through PowerShell. So in this module, we'll take a quick look at how Azure AD applications integrate with Azure Active Directory to give you that single sign-on experience across many different types of applications from many different companies. So to begin with, understand that Azure Active Directory is pre-integrated with literally hundreds of pre-existing software as a service applications. Now, you see some simple examples here such as Office 365, but SAP, Intuit for QuickBooks, Facebook, Fidelity Investments is shown here. Even things like Dropbox or Box for file storage can all leverage Azure Active Directory as their source of authentication. So rather than you having an account with that software provider integrates with your Azure Active Directory instance, and the accounts and the users that are allowed to use it are controlled by Azure Active Directory. So you have one credential that you can use to log on to many, many different software as a service applications from many different companies. Now the great thing is that these applications are all pre-integrated, so the setup and configuration is all done from within the Azure portal. All you need to do is have, in many cases, and again it varies depending on the software that you're integrating with, but typically you have an enterprise agreement or an enterprise account, and between that application and the Azure portal, it's a very simple process to complete the integration. So here's an example. You simply go into the Azure Gallery. You can search for any one of the hundreds of available applications, add it to your Azure Active Directory, and that enables you to govern which users are allowed to authenticate to that application using their Azure Active Directory account. This is useful, for example, if you only have maybe a fixed number of licenses. You can assign only that certain number of Azure Active Directory user accounts, and those accounts are now using the corporate license so that user doesn't have to pay for the service, for example. It's covered by the corporate account. You can also add custom AAD-aware apps. Now, these are a little more involved, and typically you've got to write code. You register the app with the AAD tenant, you've got to write the code in the app to understand and authenticate against Azure AD. The benefit you get is your application no longer has to worry about having a user creation, user management system. You're simply handing that job to Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory acts as the source of users, the source of authentication, the source of passwords and policies, and your application can focus on doing the job it was designed to do. There's a couple of options for this. Number one, you can do Azure AD single sign-on, which is a complete federation between Azure AD and your application. You can use password SSO, where it simply synchronizes the passwords. So you have two accounts in two places, but the passwords always match. And then you can also use existing single sign-on technologies like Active Directory Federation services to complete that for you. So now let's take a look at going through the gallery and actually adding an Azure-aware application. Now we'll take a look at how we implement what is probably one of the most powerful functions of Azure Active Directory, which is its ability to federate logon across tens, if not hundreds, of enterprise software as a service applications. So to kind of see this in action and get a sense of what this is all about, we're going to use Dropbox, simply because Dropbox, the way they've set it up, allows us to see a lot of the configuration steps without needing to go purchase a Dropbox enterprise account. So what I'm going to do is go to my app directory, and we're going to add an external application. So I just clicked Applications, click Add, and I'm going to add an application from the gallery. Now, this is a list of thousands of applications that have configured themselves to enable federation with Azure Active Directory. In other words, you can use these applications instead of having a local user or subscribing to all these individual companies. You can have an enterprise account or a corporate account and use your Azure Active Directory to control which users are allowed to use these SaaS applications. So we'll see this in action. It'll kind of make a little more sense. So let's click on Dropbox to add it to our Azure Active Directory. Now, once this is added, we're going to need to go configure the link between Dropbox for Business and our account. And this is going to vary depending on the application you add. Not all the applications, work the exact same way or have the exact same configuration. So it varies from app to app. But Dropbox is pretty simple, so I've elected to use this one. So step one is we want to configure single sign-on. We want to allow you to use your Azure Active Directory credentials as your Dropbox for Business credentials. And so to do that, we're simply going to use password sign-on, which allows Azure Active Directory to remember Dropbox credentials. It's probably not the most secure method, but it works great, and it works just fine, and it's also fairly simple to set up. So we'll click OK on that. The next step is we want to configure automatic account provisioning. So in other words, if a user in my company who I've permitted to use Dropbox for Business attempts to access it, I want to automatically provision a new Dropbox account for that user. And so we can click Configure Account Provisioning, and this is a simple wizard where you would click Enable Account Provisioning. It requires your administrator Dropbox account, which I don't have, so I can't fully complete this. But Enable Account Provisioning, log on as my administrator, check a box, and it's set up. And then finally, and this is where the real power comes in, we assign accounts. And what I'm doing here is I'm indicating which of my Active Directory, my Azure Active Directory user accounts are allowed to use Dropbox for Business under my corporate subscription. So I'm going to give Bob access to Dropbox for Business. Now, what this enables Bob to do is whenever he goes to Dropbox.com and logs on, he can actually log on using his Azure Active Directory username and password. This will automatically create a new Dropbox account for him that's part of my Dropbox for Business subscription and therefore paid by the company. If Bob leaves the company or I no longer want him to have access to that, all I've got to do is come back into Azure Active Directory and remove him from Dropbox for Business, and he loses access to that. If he wants Dropbox, he's now got to go pay for it for himself. He's no longer covered under the corporate umbrella. So by doing this, you can now have partnerships and subscriptions with any number of software as a service applications. And you can see from the marketplace, if I come back to the marketplace here, the list is extremely long. Everything from Citrix, Facebook at Work, I come down to some, for example, human resources applications. There's various education applications. So again, thousands and thousands of different software applications where you can control access for your employees using Azure Active Directory. So a common question that's often asked is, well, what if I want to break up the administration of my Azure Active Directory into, something like I would have with Active Directory directory services using organizational units to help, delegate administration. Well, you can have multiple directories within Azure Active Directory. And this can be for, use case scenarios such as live test and production. You could also do this for departments. You can do this for users that one group manages versus another group manages. So you can have multiple directories for lots and lots of different reasons, and you really have as many directories as you want, as long as you demonstrate that you have positive control over the domain. Additionally, many cloud services can use Azure Active Directory for their source of authentication. The whole idea behind Azure Active Directory is that you have one directory of users, and that directory is used by all applications that you have, regardless of where on the internet those applications reside. So some examples are Office 365. If you're a user of Office 365, Office 365 has its own list of users and groups. If you have both Azure and Office 365, you can tell Office 365, hey, use Azure Active Directory as your database of users and groups. You can do the same thing with Windows Intune. You can tell it Azure Active Directory is the source of all your users and groups and your permissions on authentication. And this extends not just to the applications that Microsoft provides and controls, but this extends beyond into many, many third-party applications. Users can be moved between directories. So as they migrate from different phases or departments or administration areas, you can easily move users from one Azure Active Directory instance to another. In this final module, we'll take a look at multi-factor authentication as it's available within Azure Active Directory. Now, first of all, what is multi-factor authentication? Well, it's the notion that you're not going to log on with just a username and password. You can, for example, have your phone, and you can have Azure text you a message to confirm that this is you by you having access to your phone. There's apps you can put on a phone that will require that you authenticate with the app before you're allowed to proceed. You can also receive phone calls. You can receive text messages. Or there's other third-party options for devices like PIN devices, the hardware PIN devices that you can have. So there's a number of available options, but the idea here is that it's more than just a password. You've got to demonstrate something you are, something you have, something you know. Any two of those three is what's called two-factor authentication. You know a password and you possess a physical device such as a phone, for example. Now, this is a great security solution for both cloud apps and on-premise applications. And Azure MultiFactor integrates with both native cloud-only applications and also through some components of Windows Server allows you to extend to include Azure MultiFactor as part of an on-premises authentication solution. So here's some examples of where this can actually apply. You can use this for Office 365. So to ensure, with Office 365, more and more internal corporate secure data is being stored in places like OneDrive for business and SharePoint Online and so forth. Well, in the past, you had to be on the physical LAN to get access to those resources. So there was another authentication mechanism, which was you had to get in the building. Now, as data moves to the cloud, we want something that's stronger than a password. And so Office 365 provides an ideal scenario for Azure multi-factor authentication. If you tell your Office 365 subscription to use Azure Active Directory as its authentication provider, you can then enable multi-factor in Azure Active Directory and further secure Office 365. For the case of remote desktop services for RDP access both to cloud resources and also to on-premises data centers supports the notion of what's called radius authentication. Radius authentication allows a logon process to ask a third party to validate it further. And so Azure Active Directory supports the notion of radius-based authentication for things like remote desktop services. So when you go to RDP into a system, you first have to validate via Azure multi-factor authentication. It also works with Active Directory Federation services. So if you're building applications that rely on Active Directory Federation services, you can integrate that with Azure Active Directory and enable multi-factor authentication. So what we're going to do now is go in and actually look at how we enable multi-factor authentication for Azure Active Directory.
Let's take a look at how easy it is to enable multi-factor authentication for a user in one of our directories. So here I've got the user Bob that we created just a little while ago. We're going to enable multi-factor authentication for Bob so he can use his phone or a mobile app to verify that he is in fact, who he claims to be before he accesses an application. As the administrator, if Bob, for example, had, higher privilege or he was accessing secure information, we might want him to have more than just a password. We may want to verify he has, for example, his mobile device that only he has access to as a way of authenticating. So this is really simple to do. We're simply going to check Bob and then enable multi-factor authentication. Where Bob will go to complete the setup is this URL right here, aka.ms/MFA setup. So we'll check enable multi-factor auth and click close. Now what Bob has to do is log on with his password and indicate what his second method of authentication is going to be. So to do that, we're just going to open an in-private browser session so we don't automatically log back on as my administrator. I'm going to go to that aka.ms/MFA setup URL. We're going to log in as Bob. Just going to grab his username here and copy it to make it simpler. And his password. I did reset Bob's password before I did this demo to make it simpler. And we're going to go ahead and click sign in. And so you'll note that it says, hey, your administrator required that you set up an additional security verification. Set it up now. So we'll click on that and it'll now take us through a very straightforward wizard that allows us to verify who Bob actually is. And he has a couple of choices. He can use a mobile app, which would actually require he to log on to a mobile app on his phone. He can use an office phone number, which is configured in his account, or he can use a pre-configured authentication phone number. Sorry, not a pre-configured, but an authentication phone number where he types in his phone number and it will actually text him or call him. And he'll get the text, reply to the text that verifies that he has his phone, or he'll answer the phone call, enter a few key sequences, and that's all that's required to set this up. Once that's complete, every time Bob attempts to authenticate to Azure Active Directory, it's automatically going to require he have that second piece of authentication in the form of a phone app or his phone for either a call, a voice call, or a text message.